The first time Lieutenant Dieter Krauss saw a P-47 Thunderbolt, he laughed so hard his oxygen mask slipped off his face. From the cockpit of his sleek W-190A5, the American fighter looked ridiculous, bloated, hunchbacked, its fuselage thick as a farm milk can. German pilots joked that the Thunderbolt was so heavy it needed its own gravitational field. Some swore it could barely turn. Others claimed it would fall out of the sky if it ever tried to climb. To Krauss, a veteran of the defense of the Reich, the fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle, was an insult to the purity of German engineering. How could something so ugly, so obese, so utterly devoid of aerodynamic grace, possibly be dangerous? But on a grey January afternoon in 1944, with contrails tearing across the upper stratosphere like claw marks, Krauss watched that joke twist into a nightmare. His Schwarm had intercepted a formation of B-17 seconds over central Germany. Standard procedure: dive out of the sun, scatter the American escort, carve into the heavy bombers before they reached the Ruhr. The plan worked at first. The Thunderbolts were late to react, their pilots pushing their engines to claw upward into the attack corridor. Then Krauss saw one of them break formation. The P-47 rolled onto its back and dropped into a screaming dive. The milk bottle was no longer sluggish. Its massive Pratt & Whitney engine turned its weight into acceleration. In seconds, it went from distant speck to oncoming beast, closing the gap with a speed Krauss had not thought possible for a fighter its size. He pulled hard on the stick, banked right, and brought his few 190 into a climbing spiral. The Thunderbolt followed. Krauss expected it to stall. He expected its pilot to lose energy. Neither happened. What happened was a flash, 8 flashes, aligned perfectly across the American's wings. Krauss never heard the sound. At 500 kilometers per hour and 25,000 feet, there is only vibration, deep, metallic, like distant thunder traveling through steel. What he saw was the impact. A line of glowing pockmarks racing across the fuselage of his wingman's aircraft. The few 190 shuddered, its canopy sprayed with metal fragments from its own shredded engine cowling. Then it simply came apart. Pieces, big pieces, tumbled off the aircraft as if a giant hand had crushed it. A wing root disintegrated. The tail snapped free. The fuselage folded in the middle like paper. All of it happened in less than 2 seconds. Krauss stared, frozen, as the pilots in his headset went silent one by one. German after-action reports would later describe the phenomenon clinically. 8x 12.7 mm, Browning M, 2 machine guns delivering over 6,000 rounds per minute, created catastrophic structural failure in the FW-190 airframe upon sustained impact. But to the men who saw it that day, it was simpler. The Thunderbolt wasn't a milk bottle anymore. It was a gun platform, an airborne buzzsaw that could rip a German fighter to pieces before the pilot even realized he was under fire. In hangars across the Reich, mechanics studied damaged aircraft and found that entire engine mounts had been cut away as if by a blade. Armor plates that once resisted Soviet 7.62 mm rounds were punched through like cardboard. The P-47's firepower didn't merely damage it, obliterated. And for the first time in the air war over Germany, the hunter-prey dynamic began to flip. The German fighter arm entered 1,944, believing that American escort fighters were inferior, that they could be outturned, outclimbed, and outfought. But by spring, squadron leaders were issuing new orders. Do not engage P-47 seconds alone. Avoid close passes. Brake early. Dive away at the first sign of their guns flashing. The transformation of the P-47 from a laughingstock to a terror weapon did not happen overnight. It was forged in the crucible of the long-range escort mission, in the brutal mathematics of airframe stress tolerance versus ballistic penetration, and in the relentless pressure of an industrial war Germany was rapidly losing. To German pilots, the Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber guns rewrote the physics of survival. It didn't need to outturn the W-190. It didn't need to outroll it. It didn't even need to match its agility. All it needed was one firing pass, 2 seconds of perfect alignment, and the fight was over. The Thunderbolt had become something new, a machine that turned firepower into strategy, a fighter that used brute force as its defining language, a weapon that shattered the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility. And, piece by piece, it began disassembling the Reich's most celebrated aircraft in mid-air. This is the story of how the P-47 mocked, underestimated, dismissed, became one of the most feared killers of the air war. Not through elegance, not through maneuver, but through overwhelming, irresistible fire. Fire that no Fu-190 could withstand. In the early months of 1943, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm still carried the swagger of an institution forged in blitzkrieg. Its pilots had cut their teeth over Poland, France, and the Balkans. They had survived the meat grinder of Russia and the deadly cat-and-mouse duels over the Channel. Against the RAF, against the VVS, against the USAAF's early forays into Europe, the German Jagdwaffe maintained a quiet, stubborn confidence. German aircraft were superior. German pilots were superior. German tactics were superior. So, when the first P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over Western Europe, that confidence hardened into open mockery. From a distance, the Thunderbolt looked like a parody of a fighter too bulbous, too heavy, too thick around the middle. Fu-190 pilots laughed that it resembled a barrel with wings. Bf-109 pilots joked that if you shot it down, you could use the fuselage as a steel bathtub. In squadron bars, over cigarettes and bitter ersatz coffee, mechanics imitated the Thunderbolt's takeoff with exaggerated, lumbering motions, pretending to struggle under its imagined weight. The Thunderbolt was, at first glance, everything a fighter was not supposed to be. German doctrine defined the ideal interceptor as lean, fast in the climb, agile in the turn, economical in fuel, built around the engine, not built to protect it. The P-47 violated every one of these principles. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2000, 800 radial engine jutted from the nose like a cast-iron cauldron. Its fuselage was wrapped in heavy armor. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing and redundant, and its weight fully loaded was nearly twice that of a Bf-109G. To German engineers, the aircraft was an industrial curiosity, a flying symbol of American excess. To German pilots, it was a target, big, slow, and easy to hit. But their misjudgment ran deeper than appearance. It grew from doctrine. The Luftwaffe had spent years honing the art of close-quarters aerial maneuver. Every German pilot was trained to fight with finesse rolling scissors, climbing spirals, slashing attacks, snap turns. Their aircraft, especially the W-190, were optimized for these maneuvers. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, seemed incapable of flying like a duelist. Its turn radius was huge. Its roll rate was mediocre. In climbing fights, it often lagged behind. To German pilots, especially the veterans, this confirmed their belief that the American aircraft was an engineering joke. But they misunderstood what the Thunderbolt was meant to be. The P-47 was not designed to win knife fights. It was designed to wage a different kind of air war. A war of firepower. A war of survivability. A war of altitude and speed. A war waged at the edge of the stratosphere. And on those terms, the P-47 was a masterpiece. From the cockpit of an FTU-190, the Thunderbolt's bulky radial engine seemed like a liability. In reality, it was one of the most powerful engines to fly in the war. The R2000, 800 could absorb punishment that would turn a liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz engine into a flaming wreck. A shattered coolant line would kill a Bf 109 inches seconds. The Thunderbolt could fly home with half its cylinders gone. German pilots did not learn this until it was too late. They aimed at the nose standard doctrine and watched, stunned, as the American fighter continued climbing, bleeding smoke but still accelerating, still fighting, still firing. The P-47 was not fragile. It was a steel anvil. By 1943, most Luftwaffe aces had flown against RAF Hurricanes, Spitfire, Mark Verves, and Soviet aircraft that were often underpowered or poorly built. They were accustomed to fighting enemies who could be bullied through aggression and superior energy tactics. The Thunderbolt broke this pattern simply by refusing to die. German pilots fired cannon shells into it, only to watch the P-47 roll inverted and dive away, trailing vapor but still very much alive. Even damaged Thunderbolts could outdive almost anything in the Luftwaffe arsenal. A veteran pilot put it bitterly in his logbook, "You cannot kill what falls faster than your bullets." At first, the Thunderbolt's survivability was chalked up to luck, but as more engagements ended with American pilots limping home in aircraft that looked like shredded boilers, German skepticism gave way to grudging respect. Even when German pilots acknowledged the P-47's toughness, they dismissed its guns. 8. Browning. 50 caliber machine guns seemed excessive, too many, too heavy, too wasteful. German doctrine favored high-velocity autocannons capable of destroying bombers with a few well-placed hits. Machine guns were seen as old-fashioned. What Luftwaffe officers failed to appreciate was the concentration of that fire. 8 guns aligned in harmonized convergence delivered over 6,000 rounds per minute, a continuous torrent of lead, dense enough to saw through aluminum, steel, and engine blocks in seconds. German pilots thought a Thunderbolt needed a perfect firing solution. They were wrong. A P-47 needed only a moment, one deflection burst, a fraction of a second, and the target could disintegrate. The Luftwaffe discovered this the hard way. Perhaps the most critical misjudgment came from Germany's shrinking high-altitude capability. As the war dragged on, fuel shortages and pilot attrition limited the Luftwaffe's ability to operate at the altitudes where American bombers flew. The Thunderbolt thrived there. It grew faster at altitude, not slower. Its turbo-supercharger turned thin air into raw, explosive power. While German fighters struggled to maintain climb rate above 25,000 feet, the P-47 became a predator. Its perceived weaknesses on the deck were irrelevant where the real battle was being fought. Perhaps the gravest mistake of all was philosophical. Germany could not grasp that the United States, still new to high-intensity air combat, could produce a fighter superior to their own. The Luftwaffe evaluated the Thunderbolt through the lens of European engineering tradition. Precision, aesthetics, agility. What they failed to understand was that American engineering operated on different principles: durability, mass production, modular design, firepower. The P-47 was not elegant. It was effective. And in war, effectiveness, not elegance, kills. By late 1943, the laughter had stopped. The Luftwaffe's first encounter with the Thunderbolt was marked by arrogance. Their second was marked by surprise. Their third was marked by fear. Because somewhere in the cloud-streaked corridors above Germany, pilots who once mocked the flying milk bottle were now radioing warnings to their squadrons. Achtung! Thunderbolts do not get in front of them. The joke had ended. The reckoning had begun. At the beginning of 1944, something subtle yet seismic began to shift in the air war over Europe. German pilots who once mocked the P-47 as a lumbering milk jug now found themselves staring at gun camera footage showing FIV 190 seconds and BF 109 seconds torn apart in mid-air. What changed was not a single upgrade or a sudden tactical revelation, but the slow accumulation of American industrial adaptation, combat learning, and a mindset that embraced brute force advantages rather than elegant solutions. The Thunderbolt's transformation from prey to predator unfolded not in a single battle, but across countless sorties where every misconception about the aircraft died one at a time. The first and perhaps most decisive change came with altitude dominance. The P-47's turbo-supercharger, a technological marvel placed awkwardly in the rear fuselage, allowed it to breathe in the thin stratospheric air where German engines gasped for life. The Luftwaffe's DB605 and BMW 801 engines were formidable at medium altitudes, but they suffered at the heights where the American bombers flew. German pilots had built their reputation fighting in environments where their agility, roll rate, and climb rate mattered. The American pilots brought the strike to a domain where raw horsepower was king. As the Thunderbolt's 2,000 horsepower plant roared at 25,000 feet, it gained what German fighters were slowly losing: the ability to dictate the vertical dimension of the fight. This advantage mattered because energy, altitude, and speed was the true currency of aerial combat by 1944. The P-47 may not have turned tightly, but it could dive faster than anything Germany produced, and it could climb back to altitude with a momentum that the W-190 struggled to follow. The Luftwaffe soon learned that the Thunderbolt pilot who began a fight above you was not simply another opponent to outmaneuver. He was a hammer, ready to strike with terrifying velocity. A high-speed dive from a P-47 was not a defensive escape, it was an offensive weapon. When a Thunderbolt pointed its nose downward and unleashed gravity alongside its engine, the airframe screamed past 500 miles per hour, a speed that caused German fighters to tremble and German pilots to hesitate. No amount of rolling or scissoring could shake off an enemy that could erase distance with such brutal acceleration. But speed alone did not make the P-47 lethal. What made it feared was what happened when that mass and velocity were paired with the 8 Browning .50 caliber guns embedded in its wings. Each gun firing at roughly 750 rounds per minute meant that a single 1-second burst sent a dozen armor-piercing incendiary rounds into a target. A full 2-second burst hurled more metal than a German fighter's entire ammunition load. The Browning M2 was not simply a machine gun, it was a physics engine. Its bullets maintained velocity, penetrated with authority, and ignited fuel tanks with unnerving reliability. The FU-190's rugged construction, once a point of national pride, was suddenly inadequate against a weapon that could shear control surfaces and tear engine mounts free with a single pass. The nature of aerial combat amplified this lethality. Most gun engagements lasted no more than 3 seconds. German pilots accustomed to dueling with cannon shells, powerful but limited in number, were suddenly confronted with a storm of projectiles that filled the sky with a density of fire no evasive maneuver could reliably escape. In the early months, many misinterpreted their own failures, believing they had flown into bombers' defensive fire rather than a fighter's guns. After-action reports corrected this misconception brutally. The damage patterns showed concentrated impacts from converging streams originating from a single Thunderbolt. When engineering teams analyzed wrecked FU-190s, they found bullet paths so tight that they appeared cut by a mechanical saw rather than random hits. The shift from mockery to fear accelerated when the P-47 learned to exploit vertical tactics with tactical discipline. American pilots, once inexperienced in European dogfighting, adapted quickly under the guidance of veteran leaders who drilled them in boom and zoom attacks. Instead of trying to match German fighters in turn fights, Thunderbolt squadrons adopted hit-and-run tactics executed from altitude, where their energy advantage was overwhelming. Dive, fire, climb, reset. The Luftwaffe's greatest strength, the individual pilot's initiative, began to erode as its aircraft became increasingly vulnerable in the vertical plane. A 109 forced into a climb against a P-47 that still had energy was already half defeated. A 190 caught in the opening seconds of a Thunderbolt's dive had no time to maneuver before pieces were torn from its wings. The psychological reversal was palpable. By mid-1944, German pilots began warning each other to brake early at the sight of an oncoming Thunderbolt. The bold head-on confrontations that had once been standard practice became rare. Even the vaunted FU-190A, feared by American B-17 crews for its deadly frontal attacks, found itself avoiding crossing patterns with P-47s, whose wall of .50 caliber fire made such maneuvers suicidal. Luftwaffe, tactics that relied on tight formations and coordinated charges, dissolved into scattered dives and early disengagements, not because the German pilots lacked courage, but because the consequences of misjudging a Thunderbolt's firing pass were catastrophic. But the transformation of the P-47 was not merely tactical, it was also industrial. American production lines refined the aircraft month after month, adding more fuel capacity, better drop tanks, improved gun sights, and aerodynamic adjustments, that incrementally increased performance. While German factories struggled under bombing raids, material shortages, and a shrinking pool of skilled labor, the United States poured machinery, parts, and precision engineering into perfecting the Thunderbolt. Each new variant closed the gap in climb rate and maneuverability while preserving the ruggedness and firepower that defined the aircraft's character. The Luftwaffe's assumption that American fighters would stagnate while German engineers produced the next technological leap proved disastrously false. It was the P-47 that improved, not the 109 or 190. The final piece of the transformation was strategic, range. At its birth, the P-47 lacked the legs to escort bombers deep into Germany. Once outfitted with drop tanks and more efficient fuel management, it gained the endurance needed to accompany bomber formations far beyond the point where German fighters had once been safe. This expansion of operational reach meant that the Luftwaffe lost its sanctuary. Airfields that once stood behind a buffer of hundreds of kilometers were suddenly vulnerable. P-47 seconds chased German fighters all the way to the deck, attacked them during landing approaches, and strafed their bases with the same lethal firepower they employed in dogfights. The Thunderbolt's 8 guns, devastating in the air, became apocalyptic against parked aircraft, trains, fuel depots, and convoys. German fighters began taking losses not only in battle, but simply while trying to get airborne. As the P-47's presence spread across Europe, German pilots no longer judged it by its shape, they judged it by its consequences. The aircraft that once inspired laughter now inspired avoidance. The fighter that once seemed slow now moved through the combat zone with domineering authority. The gun platform, once dismissed as crude, became an instrument of frightening precision. A Luftwaffe ace who survived multiple encounters summarized the reversal succinctly. We did not fear the P-47 because it was beautiful or maneuverable. We feared it because if it lined up on you, you ceased to exist. The evolution of the Thunderbolt did not merely improve its combat record, it altered the psychology of the air war. German pilots who had mocked its bulk now treated every encounter with caution. Those who survived long enough came to view it as the embodiment of the new American way of war. Heavy, fast, durable, relentless, and backed by an industrial base that could refine and multiply its strength faster than Germany could respond. By the time the Luftwaffe fully understood what the Thunderbolt had become, it no longer possessed the pilots, the fuel, or the aircraft to counter it effectively. The P-47's transformation was not accidental. It was the natural outcome of a machine designed for a different kind of battle, one in which survivability, firepower, altitude, and speed mattered more than turn radius or elegance. The Luftwaffe had mocked what it did not understand. Then it learned the truth in flame and twisting metal. The milk bottle had become a juggernaut, and once it reached its full potential, no German fighter could face it on equal terms. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's pilots were no longer laughing at the Thunderbolt. Their derision had evaporated in the crucible of combat, replaced by an unease that hardened into a grim certainty. The P-47 did not behave like a traditional fighter, and its guns did not behave like the weapons they were trained to face. Each confrontation carved deeper into the German psyche, and each wreckage that fell burning into a field or forest reminded the Luftwaffe that their beloved Fu 190 seconds and Bf 109 seconds were no longer adequate for the war they were fighting. The collapse of German airframes under the Thunderbolt's fire was not merely a technical failure, it was an unraveling of assumptions, doctrines, and confidence that had defined German air combat since 1939. The root of the crisis lay in the structural reality of German fighters. The W190A series, though robust in low and medium altitudes, carried a design philosophy rooted in agility, minimal weight, and offensive punch. It was built to outroll and outturn, not to withstand prolonged streams of high-velocity fire. Its wings were light, optimized for responsiveness. Its fuselage relied on skin tension for much of its strength. Its control surfaces were engineered for precision, not survival under duress. Against Soviet or British aircraft in earlier campaigns, these qualities had been an asset. But when subjected to the concentrated fury of 8.50 caliber guns, these same design choices became fatal vulnerabilities. Every German pilot understood the logic of cannon warfare. A single 20mm shell could shatter a bomber's wing spar or punch through a fighter's cockpit. The Luftwaffe's entire doctrine was built around the idea that precision bursts of cannon fire delivered by elite pilots could break an enemy formation. But this doctrine assumed the enemy played by similar rules: brief firing windows, limited ammunition, and damage inflicted by discrete impacts. The Thunderbolt fought by different physics. Its guns poured out an uninterrupted stream of metal, not single impacts but overlapping chains of kinetic trauma that hammered the airframe with relentless force. A 2-second burst from a P-47 did not pierce it, shredded. It did not damage it, destabilized. It did not disable, it dissolved. The effects were immediate and horrifying. German mechanics, hardened men who had cleaned blood and aluminum from airframes for years, found themselves confronted with wrecks that seemed almost unreal. 190 wings arriving on salvage trucks were torn open lengthwise as though unzipped. Control surfaces were missing entirely, shredded into dust by overlapping impacts. Fuel tanks that were supposed to be self-sealing had been sprayed with so many incendiary rounds that their outer layers burned away before the sealing compounds could activate. Engine cowls that once protected the BMW 801's radial cylinder rows were removed cleanly, as if struck by a giant blade. Pilots, too, were forced to confront the brutality firsthand. Many who survived their first engagements described a moment of disbelief, an instantaneous recognition that their aircraft was no longer an extension of their body, but a failing shell around them. One moment the engine roared. The next, the propeller spun freely as the gearbox was ripped apart. One moment the stick responded. The next, the elevator cables snapped and the aircraft pitched into an uncontrolled dive. Some airframes disintegrated so completely that their fragments fell like confetti. German search teams tasked with locating crash sites often found debris fields stretching hundreds of meters, with no distinguishable fuselage intact enough to salvage. As the structural failures mounted, German pilots adapted instinctively. They began flying looser formations to avoid being caught in the killing cone of a P-47's dive. They abandoned tight turns that risked stalling under fire. They stopped committing to head-on passes unless absolutely necessary. The Fu-190's famed roll rate, once the pride of the Luftwaffe, now served primarily as an escape tool rather than an aggressive maneuver. In many squadrons, an unspoken rule emerged: never let a Thunderbolt get on your 6, not even for a heartbeat, because a heartbeat was enough. But the Thunderbolt did not simply break aircraft. It broke the rhythm of combat. German pilots who were accustomed to dueling, maneuvering, and testing their adversaries found themselves facing an enemy who erased the middle stages of a fight. There was no probing, no dancing, no cautious exchange of fire. The P-47 Dove, with murderous intent, fired once and left its target in pieces. In this environment, experience became less important than reaction time, and even the most skilled aces were caught off guard by a fighter that turned fleeting mistakes into instant catastrophe. The Luftwaffe's veteran pool, already thinning from the demands of defending the Reich, now shrank at an accelerating pace. The psychological collapse was not confined to the cockpit. It spread through maintenance crews, operations officers, and squadron leaders, who watched sortie reports come back with the same grim refrain: shot down by Thunderbolt aircraft disintegrated. Every loss eroded confidence. Every mission briefing added another layer of caution. Eventually, the fear became internalized. German pilots began anticipating death the moment a Thunderbolt angled toward them. Even when they escaped, the memory of the impact's bright flashes on the canopy, the sickening vibration of rounds hitting the fuselage, the momentary blindness caused by metal fragments spraying through the cockpit lingered long after landing. The disparity between German and American losses reflected not only firepower, but survivability. A Thunderbolt could return home riddled with holes larger than a fist, dragging one wing, its engine coughing black smoke. German fighters with similar damage rarely made it back. The Lufthansa-like pride in engineering that once defined the Luftwaffe became a source of despair. How could a fighter twice the size of the few 190 absorb twice the punishment and still fight back? The answer lay not in a single factor, but in a philosophy of construction that prioritized durability over elegance. The Thunderbolt's thick skin, massive radial engine, rugged internal bracing, and layered fuel protection created a platform that could take a beating and keep firing. German aircraft, built for agility, crumpled under the same punishment. The final breakdown occurred when the P-47 shifted from an escort fighter to a hunter-killer. It no longer waited for German fighters to approach bomber formations. It sought them out, chasing them across the sky, diving through clouds, attacking them as they climbed, as they dove, as they limped back toward their airfields. The Luftwaffe's once dominant home field advantage evaporated. German pilots could no longer rely on altitude, terrain, or proximity to friendly bases to save them. The Thunderbolt followed them everywhere. Its long-range variants reached deep into Germany's industrial heartland. Its later models accelerated even faster and climbed even harder. Its pilots, once inexperienced, now carried hundreds of hours of combat insight. The Luftwaffe found itself fighting opponents who not only outgunned them, but understood exactly how to exploit their greatest weaknesses. By late summer 1944, the phrase "Thunderbolt overhead" carried a meaning that few Luftwaffe veterans would ever forget. It meant danger not only to aircraft, but to morale. It meant that no matter how skillful you were one dive away from annihilation. It meant that the sky itself had shifted allegiance. The German fighter arm, once the pride of the Reich, was now trapped in a war of attrition against a machine designed to outlast, outgun, and outfight it. The P-47's firepower did more than destroy aircraft. It destroyed the Luftwaffe's sense of invincibility, the belief that German engineering and German discipline ensured superiority in the air. It shattered doctrines built on agility and precision. It taught surviving pilots that firepower, brutal, overwhelming, relentless firepower could rewrite the rules of aerial combat. And in doing so, it marked the beginning of the end for Germany's air defense. One Fw-190 at a time, each vanished in a burst of 50 caliber fire that lasted no longer than a breath. In the months when the Thunderbolt ceased to be a curiosity and became a catastrophe for the Luftwaffe, something far deeper than tactics or technology began to fracture. The German fighter arm had long defined itself not merely by skill, but by a worldview, an ideology that fused engineering pride, tactical purity, and a near mystical belief in the superiority of the Jagdflieger. From Spain to Poland to Britain to the Soviet Union, generations of German pilots had internalized a truth that felt self-evident. Their aircraft were the sharpest steel, their training the hardest grindstone, their doctrine the purest distillation of aerial combat. When they looked at the Thunderbolt, they did not see a threat. They saw an affront to that worldview, an obese machine that offended their aesthetic sense of what a fighter should be. The collapse that followed was therefore not only material but spiritual. The German ideology of air superiority rested on the conviction that finesse could overcome force, that elegant engineering could conquer brute strength. The Bf 109 embodied this ethos, a small, precise instrument that rewarded technical mastery. The Fv 190 expanded upon it, adding muscularity without abandoning the core principle of responsiveness and efficiency. Both aircraft were variations on the same philosophy. A fighter must be light, sharp, and agile, optimized for the pilot's skill. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, represented the negation of that ideal. It was heavy where the German fighters were light, armored where they were bare, simple where they were intricate, and designed not around pilot virtuosity, but around survivability and ballistic saturation. It was an American answer to a German question, and German doctrine was wholly unprepared for the answer. As the P-47's lethality became undeniable, the ideological tension within the Luftwaffe intensified. Pilots who had scoffed at American aircraft suddenly found their comrades vaporized in moments. their aircraft shredded by a machine that refused to follow the established script of air dueling. German fighters had always been instruments of precision. American fighters were becoming instruments of inevitability. Each engagement made this clearer. A Thunderbolt did not need to outmaneuver you because it could erase you with a single firing pass. It did not need to conserve ammunition because it carried enough to fight entire squadrons. It did not need to survive elegantly because it was built like a fortress. German pilots who had been raised to respect the craft of dogfighting now found themselves facing a machine that bypassed craft entirely and won through physics alone. This inversion ripped at the cultural fabric of the Luftwaffe. The pride of the German pilot had always rested on the belief that the man mattered more than the machine. Even when superior Allied aircraft appeared, such as the Spitfire Mark 9 or the Yak 3, Luftwaffe pilots reassured themselves that German flying skill could compensate for material disadvantages. Yet the Thunderbolt broke this psychological fallback by demonstrating that no amount of finesse could counter a storm of fire so dense that even aces were cut down before their instincts could activate. Survivors who limped home with bullets embedded in their instruments and fuel tanks boiling with holes were confronted with a demoralizing truth. The American strategy did not require the elegance of a duel. It required only contact. The deeper ideological wound came from the realization that the United States had solved aerial warfare through a different paradigm entirely. German aircraft were built by craftsmen. American aircraft were built by factories. German doctrine favored the virtuoso. American doctrine favored the system. The Luftwaffe's pride in its elite aces became its weakness in a war where the US could field thousands of competent, well-trained pilots, backed by millions of tons of industrial output. Each Thunderbolt was not merely a fighter, it was a message that the age of artisanal aviation was ending. The war had transitioned into an era where power, durability, and mechanical aggression mattered more than fine maneuvering or minimalist design. This shift devastated the Luftwaffe's ideological certainty. For years, its pilots had operated under the belief that German engineering represented the pinnacle of aviation. Now they were forced to accept that American engineering, while crude in appearance, had embraced a different kind of brilliance, one that optimized mass, survivability, and firepower in a way the Luftwaffe could neither match nor counter. This realization was not merely humiliating, it was destabilizing. A worldview built on superiority cannot survive sustained evidence of inferiority, and by 1944, the skies over Europe provided that evidence daily. The psychological erosion deepened as German pilots observed how the Thunderbolt absorbed their best blows. They fired cannon shells into its engine only to watch it continue diving. They struck its wings and saw the aircraft wobble but recover. They damaged its hydraulics and discovered it could still land. Each encounter reinforced a grinding sense of futility. Meanwhile, a single burst from the P-47 could slice through an FW-190 like a cleaver through bone. The asymmetry between effort and consequence became unbearable. Luftwaffe pilots joked bitterly that American fighters were built like tanks because Americans themselves were too clumsy to fly anything delicate. But under the humor lay a growing fear that delicacy no longer mattered. The ideological collapse culminated when German pilots realized that the Thunderbolt was not an anomaly but a template. The P-51 Mustang, arriving in numbers, embodied the same American philosophy: brutal firepower, rugged construction, industrial precision paired with refined aerodynamics and long-range performance. The Luftwaffe found itself confronting not one American doctrine, but an entire lineage of designs that unified power, endurance, and adaptability. The P-47 had taught a brutal lesson. America's strength was not in individual aircraft, but in the system that produced them. In this context, the German reverence for pilot skill, individual initiative, and engineering finesse became an ideological trap. The Thunderbolt shattered the myth that aerial combat was an art preserved only for virtuosos. It declared instead that victory belonged to those who could combine technology, mass, and firepower into a single expression of overwhelming force. The Luftwaffe, once the master of the skies, now found itself clinging to an outdated creed as the P-47 carved through its formations with impersonal efficiency. By the end of 1944, the laughter that once greeted the Thunderbolt had vanished. In its place was a sobering acceptance. The American way of war, industrial, heavy, relentless, had broken the German myth of aerial supremacy. The ideology that had once sustained the Luftwaffe was now untenable, eroded not merely by loss but by the revelation that the future no longer belonged to the elegant duel but to the overwhelming strike, and in that future, the Thunderbolt stood as both symbol and executioner. When the air war over Europe finally tilted irreversibly against the Luftwaffe, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood at the center of that transformation, a machine once mocked as a flying milk bottle, now etched into the memories of German pilots as a symbol of overwhelming, unavoidable force. Its legacy at the end of the conflict was not simply that it won duels or provided escort. It reshaped the very logic of aerial warfare. Every engagement in which a Thunderbolt tore apart an FD 190 inches 2 seconds forced the Luftwaffe to confront a truth it had resisted. The era of the elegant, knife-edge duel was over. Speed, altitude, survivability, and firepower had fused into a single philosophy, and the P-47 embodied it long before its reputation caught up with its capabilities. As the Thunderbolt matured, it became clear that the American approach to air combat, industrial, data-driven, system-oriented, was not an improvisation, but a strategic worldview. The P-47 could dive faster because its engineers cared more about structural strength than weight. It could endure catastrophic damage because its designers assumed pilots would need to fly home through chaos. It could unleash a torrent of gunfire capable of disintegrating enemy fighters because the United States possessed the industrial depth to build weapons with redundancy and excess. German pilots who had grown up believing in finesse found themselves overwhelmed by a machine that operated by crushing margins rather than delicate balances. This was the blueprint for the future, war as a contest of systems, not virtuosos. The psychological consequences of this shift lingered long after the battles themselves. Surviving Luftwaffe pilots spoke with a mix of bitterness and awe about the first time a Thunderbolt opened fire on them. They remembered the incandescent flashes from its wing roots, the jarring vibration of rounds striking their aircraft, the sickening loss of control that followed. Many could recall the exact moment when they realized the fight was no longer equal, that the American fighter did not merely match them, but exceeded them in ways that rendered skill insufficient. The P-47 did not defeat the Luftwaffe through brilliance, it defeated it through inevitability. American pilots, too, carried the Thunderbolt's legacy into the post-war era. Many credited the aircraft with their survival, recalling how its armor saved them from cannon strikes or how its engine pulled them out of dives that should have been fatal. Others remembered the sheer authority of its firepower, how a single burst could end an engagement before it had even begun. These memories shaped the doctrine of post-war air forces, which increasingly favored fighters built not just for agility, but for durability, speed, and multi-role capability. The DNA of the Thunderbolt can be traced through the jet age from the F-86 Sabre to the A-10 Thunderbolt II, each inheriting a piece of its philosophy, toughness paired with teeth. Strategically, the P-47 symbolized the turning tide of the air campaign. When it gained the range to escort bombers deep into Germany, the Luftwaffe lost not only aircraft but the very oxygen of war: time, space, and initiative. Each Thunderbolt that dove onto a German fighter group, each strafing run that shredded airfields and convoys, narrowed Germany's options until the fighter arm could no longer sustain coherent resistance. Industrial capacity had met ideological certainty and exposed its hollowness. In this confrontation, the Thunderbolt was both the instrument and the proof. By war's end, the aircraft that began as a joke had become one of the most respected machines in aviation history. Its silhouette, once ridiculed, came to represent the triumph of engineering pragmatism over romantic design. Its 8.50 calibers, once dismissed as outdated, demonstrated the devastating potential of focused, sustained firepower. and its performance across thousands of sorties showed that in a war of attrition, the survivor is the victor. The P-47's ultimate legacy is not that it outflew German fighters, nor that it outlasted them, but that it rewrote the equation of air combat. It proved that the future belonged to aircraft built not for beauty but for dominance, not for duels but for campaigns, not for the few but for the many. And in doing so, it turned the laughter of its enemies into silence. The milk bottle had revealed its true nature. It had always been a hammer.